Welcome to From the Mind of Christine McConnell. We are still here working in this guest room, but now we've moved on to another furniture piece, and this is the Vanity. Now, obviously, when you're working on a really special room like this, you want to make sure everything in the room is meaningful and beautiful. I could not find a vanity that looked right for the life of me. So when you find yourself in that position, sometimes it's just easier to try to make something yourself. Several months ago, I had seen this incredible mirror at the Syracuse Antiques Exchange, and it was so dinged up and damaged that I was like, do I really want to tackle a project that big right now? But then obviously a project that big came around and I needed it, and thankfully nobody had bought it and it had been moved up to the attics. All right, so this mirror is pretty banged up. Originally, I think it had a beveled glass mirror and that most likely broke. And at some point this was repaired. The first thing we want to do is sort of spot out any kind of weak points and stabilize those before we move on to the cosmetic stuff. The entire crown of this mirror had become actually broken away and loose enough to the point that all it took was a minimal amount of manipulation to remove. Once that was done, I cleaned up the area and then began addressing the back of it to prepare for a new support. Trying to dislodge these nails from this crown piece could have caused obviously a lot more damage, and we don't want to do that. So I used my Dremel with a cutter attachment just to make the surface flush. The original support had become so brittle that it just completely needed to be removed and replaced with a new support system. You have to be really careful here because obviously if you use screws that are too long, they could actually puncture through and break that glass mirror, which I really didn't want to do. We're now ready to seat the crown back into its original place, and I'm making sure to pre-drill, and you should always do this because otherwise the wood can easily split and cause way bigger problems. This is feeling really stable now, so now I can actually move on to some of these other smaller little damaged areas. You just know that at some point in the past, some mover thought this was a handle and that's what caused this break. So for the love of God, if you ever touch an antique, never assume anything decorative is strong enough to actually support the full weight of the piece you're looking at. I'm experimenting a bit here with this water weld stuff. It's kind of like a two-part epoxy in a roll. You just pinch off a little piece, mix it really thoroughly, and then you can just apply it anywhere and very quickly it sets like a rock. It's sticky, it's incredibly messy, so wear gloves if you try this. But it's also really great for these sorts of little pieces where you want them to be set like stone almost. Here I'm mixing one of my very favorite go-to epoxies, and it's the Gorilla Glue brand. You just mix the two parts super thoroughly, and then you can use this to just fill in any of those cracks where you really want a strong bond on both sides. Another bit of damage that this mirror has sustained is there is a whole wooden chunk back here missing. So I'm going to lay another piece behind that with a pencil, mark out where it was, and replace it. Again, I'm being really sort of cognizant of the fact that there is a glass mirror here on the other side. So you always want to be thinking about that when you're taken hammers or drills or anything like that to an antique that has glass. The crown on this mirror was missing one of its horns completely, and so I'm going to pre-drill in here and put several wooden skewers just to add a little bit of support before I jump to the next step. Okay, so now it's feeling pretty stable, and now we're going to start addressing some of these wounded little bits using plaster of Paris. This is a really great product that you can pick up at any hobby store, any place you go to. And one of the amazing things about it is also one of the kind of drawbacks, and that is it sets incredibly fast. So it's really best to work in small little batches and address one little area at a time. I don't really know that there's a perfect ratio. I think the perfect ratio is whatever you need for this particular thing that you're working on. Sometimes I needed a little runnier, and for this initial pass, I really wanted something kind of thick and chunky that I could mold into a shape. This is actually an incredibly fun sort of project to tackle if you don't really care about how long it takes. One of the nice things is this stuff sets like, I don't know, in like 10 to 15 minutes. So very quickly after you've applied it and vaguely shaped it into the sort of silhouette that you're looking for, you can actually start sculpting away and carving into it. Something I attempted and got really mixed results doing was putting some of this plaster of Paris in a piping bag and piping some of the shapes that I needed. They were extremely rough because it set so quickly, but it did kind of lend itself to what I needed it to do. Once the bigger dings had been addressed, then I started looking over any of the little cracks and imperfections just so I can get this thing back in tip-top shape. Once things had set, I broke out my Dremel tool with a sanding attachment and just started chiseling away. And it was really just kind of this process of going back and forth, adding some plaster, letting it dry, going at it with the Dremel, and then maybe just even adding more plaster. So it was a it was a process that took days. I'm not even sure, but it was well worth it when it was done. Here I am back with this piping bag. Try as I might, I could not get anything terribly defined using this method, but it was really helpful for just sort of shaping things how I needed them to go as like a rough starting point. And from there, I was able to use a sculpting tool to continue to refine them. To get rid of any air bubbles or gaps, I would take a watered down version of the plaster and mix it into any of the nooks and crannies. And then after that, I just take a brush dipped in water to kind of smooth everything out. This plaster can dry out your skin like crazy, but honestly, there's really no better tool than your bare fingertips. To reinforce that support that I did there on the back, I'm taking more of this plaster and just kind of filling everything in so this thing is not going to budge. I've recently discovered the podcast My Favorite Murder, which I'm sure I'm like the last person on earth to just come upon this. But it has been so much fun listening to while I work that I just put headphones on, and it just didn't even matter how long this took because I was having so much fun while I was doing it. If by some chance you haven't listened to My Favorite Murder and you're going to get into it, two episodes I can strongly suggest to you is the episode where they tackle Typhoid Mary, and the other one is an episode called Coincidence Island, which are just ridiculously fun to listen to. Once I started to get really close, I started just taking a little piece of sandpaper to refine all of the nooks and crannies. It's funny how going in, I only had noticed a few sort of flaws or bits of damage, and obviously the more you stare at it, you realize, oh, it's missing a piece here, it's missing a piece there. So I did my very best to go over everything and fix all of it. Okay, so the plaster is mended and it's time to move on to our next step, which is addressing the desk for the vanity. Initially, I thought I would be able to find something that was the right height and shallowness, but I just couldn't. I looked everywhere. I was actually at the Syracuse Antiques Exchange talking to my friend Matt, who's one of the co-owners, and he suggested just getting two nightstands and putting a board between them. I loved that idea. I jumped on it immediately, but I did realize finding antique nightstands is almost impossible as they are incredibly rare to come by. It wasn't a common thing. So I did find two modern-made nightstands that look pretty close to what I need. They're just the right height and shallowness, but the color is a little too dark. So our next step is going to be stripping those down and getting them ready to stain. I found these nightstands on the website Wayfair, and if I'm being just totally honest with you, they were way pricier than I had wanted to spend on this, but they were so perfect and I had run out of time, so I just had to bite the bullet and deal with it. Oh, let me pop in here really quick to tell you, I used this citrus strip on this particular project and it was so much better than that other product that I used on the bed frame. It works a lot faster, it's not quite as messy, and it just goes a lot better. So I would definitely suggest using this if you're tackling removing varnishes and stains. Because we just did this process on that bed frame episode that you saw last month, I'm not going to spend too much time on this entire process, but it's a big process. If you watch the bed frame episode, you'll know this takes a long time to do. But thankfully, it did go actually pretty quickly, a lot faster than the bed frame. And from there, I was able to move on to the exciting parts that I was looking forward to. So while those nightstands dry, let's tackle the next step, which is making this mirror look like it was made out of wood. We did something similar to this up in the guest room on the cornices, but because obviously the mirror is so much lower to the ground, closer to the eye, it means it's under a lot more scrutiny. So I am going to have to employ a lot more detail. The colors that I created for the cornices to mimic wood needed a little tweaking, I felt. So I've done that here, and now let's see how it works. The very first shade I'm starting off is what I would call my base color, and this is a really soft caramel kind of color. Ultimately, I plan to take all of these colors to Sherwin-Williams and have gallons made of each of them. That way I can end up with a barcode for each color. And then if you are in the second tier and up, I will be providing that barcode so that if you want to recreate these colors, all you have to do is take that barcode to your local Sherwin-Williams and they can mix the paint for you. Once the mirror was fully covered, I took this second color, this main wash brown, mixed it with some water so it'd be nice and runny. And from there, I took a chip brush with a pointed pair of scissors and just took little chunks out of it here and there, just to kind of make it look even more staggered and kind of unpredictable. I then dipped that brush in this mixture and created these strokes that were meant to mimic wood grain. That larger brush will really only get you so far, so you do at some point have to switch over to a really fine point brush, and with that same paint mixture, just continue all of those veins that you started with the larger brush. Something else that really lends well to the illusion that this is real wood is to go into all of the flat back areas, really kind of any shadow area, and fill those voids with a solid dark color. Something I found is that not any one of these specific techniques is going to sell this look all by itself, but once you combine them all and you have multiple layers going on, that's the trick that kind of ultimately makes this whole thing believable. Once that it all set, I took a large brush and with that same main wash brown color, went over everything and then took a damp wet rag right there with me and wiped it off all of the high points. At this stage of the process, it's really important to work quickly and work on kind of smaller areas and don't let this wash sit too long before you wipe it off, because from there it can kind of start to dry and you can end up with mistakes. But if you work quickly, it will go very smoothly. Once that had all dried, it was time to take this highlight color, which is actually a little bit darker than that first base color that we painted the whole mirror. And with a very dry brush, you're just going to gently create these highlighted streaks that natural wood would have. Once I was feeling really good about that, it was time to take the shadow paint color and do that exact same technique, creating some dark shadows. To enhance the aged antique effect I'm shooting for here, I'm taking that darkest shadow color and going back into all of those shadowed areas that I did before. And then I'm taking a damp rag and blotting up the center, which creates a little bit of a highlight there in the middle, and it really just kind of lends itself well to that old look. I continued this process over the whole mirror, making sure all of the kind of nooks and crannies were as dark as I could get them, and it really just did such a great job at making everything kind of pop and adding a lot of dimension. We're finally to one of the best parts of this process, which is varnishing. I'm using a satin polyurethane, and it's an oil-based varnish, and it just is going to seal all of this in and hopefully really sell the look that we've been working at here. The only drawback I have seen so far with this technique is sometimes it can look a little too cool, and I've even adjusted my colors to see if I can correct that, and it doesn't seem to do it. So the best way to correct this afterward is to take translucent paint, and you can get this in the airbrush section of your hobby store, mix together the yellow and the red, and add a lot of water, a lot more than you just saw me add. And then you just kind of go over it with a wash, and that will just kind of tint it to a warmer shade. All right, while we let that set, which by the way, I feel like I'm getting better at this technique. I'm so incredibly happy with how that came out, and I feel like I just might get better and better at it. So look out for more projects like that in the future. So while we let that set, let's jump back to the nightstands and stain them and accent them to match the mirror. Once the nightstands had been stripped and completely dried out, I did realize that they had a very reddish tone to them. And so to sort of correct that a little bit, I used the most ashen stain I could possibly find. And even then, it was still very warm, but it worked out really well. I'm very happy with it. I used a liquid stain instead of a gel stain because that was the grayest or most muted one that I had on hand. So I just brushed it on, let it sit for a moment, and then wiped it off. For the center of this desk that I'm creating, I decided that I really wanted kind of a glassed-in shadow box sort of thing. And so I found this piece here at an antique store, and it was pretty rough looking. And I wanted to create something that looked a little bit cleaner, and I didn't really have the time to pull this off. So luckily, my friend Matt at the Syracuse Antiques Exchange was able to take on this project and adjust it to the specifications that I needed. I'd like to essentially sandwich this lid underneath the lip on those nightstands. And so to do that, I have to just chisel away a little bit of this decorative piping so that it can slide really easily. Once it was all prepped, I stained it to match the two nightstands. So that the dressers and that shadow box in the center would match everything that I did to the mirror, I did take that dark shadow color that I used on the mirror, did that same technique where I just filled in all of the cracks and then took a damp rag and wiped away the excess. The last step with these nightstands is to just varnish them with the same polyurethane that I used on the mirror. To ensure that the top lid of that shadow box would slide easily, I did put felt on the base piece and then just under the lip on those nightstands. The backing on this mirror was incredibly flimsy, so I did want to put sort of a supportive piece of plywood on the back there to protect the mirror and just kind of make it look a little tidier. So the way I did this was I took a large piece of paper, put it kind of all around the back and mushed it along the edges so I could get kind of an outline of what that shape was, replicated that onto a piece of plywood, and then used a jigsaw to cut it out. Here you can see what was left of the backing was just kind of holding on by a thread. this in place, again, I'm just using a pre-drill with very short screws and just pinning it in all along the edges. I have terrible penmanship freehand, so I have a message that I'm hoping people in the future, take heed of. And that is that I really don't want anybody to, like a mover or something like that, to ever take this and try to lift it by those handles, because I think that's happened twice. And so hopefully someone will listen. You can't make any guarantees, but I'm just giving it my best try. All right, now the really fun part of putting this all together. Now, because that mirror is so heavy, you want to make sure those support slats on the back are made out of hardwood and are kind of on the thicker side. You don't want anything too flimsy. To join everything together, I'm using deck screws, which are incredibly sturdy, and they have a T25 head, meaning there's not going to be any slippage with your drill, which is really terrific. Another thing I can tell you is always make sure you pre-drill. You don't want any of the wood splitting, and you also want to make sure that this is something that can be taken apart again and put back together. To get this all together, what I've done here is I've actually taken that shadow box and propped it up to the exact height that I need it using just this little footstool and some random books that I had laying around. And that way, when I drill this in, I know it's resting at the exact place I'm going to need it to be. Every one of these screws is going into a really solid piece of wood, so nothing is going into just voids or areas that don't have a ton of support, because you really want this to obviously be as sturdy as you can get it. I found these decorative iron elements online and ordered them, and they are the perfect thing to kind of make this whole thing look like it was meant to go together. Once the scariest part of my life was over, which was affixing that super heavy mirror, I needed just one more decorative little piece to go right there at the back of where that shadow box ends. Now, typically I would show you the beauty shots of this finished, but I jumped ahead to the next part before filming those, and I don't quite want to reveal it just yet. So to avoid spoiling a future surprise, here is what it looks like at this particular point. All right, so this is where we're going to stop for today. We've covered a lot, and there is still actually, if you can believe it, a lot more coming for this particular vanity. So something I learned here is if you are ever out and about and you see a damaged, really ornate, beautiful mirror, desk, or anything that's an antique and it's inexpensive, snatch it up, put it in your attic, put it in your garage, just put it somewhere. So ultimately one day you can fix it and you can end up with incredibly beautiful things in your house. And you get kind of the pride of knowing that you kind of brought them back to life. So anyhow, thank you so much for your patience. I can't wait for you to see the rest of this because it's amazing. So in the meantime, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you again very soon.